Hey, how's it going, everybody? So I wanted to just discuss a little bit about a video with Stefan Molyneux on the Tom Woods Show. And the reason I decided to go ahead and tackle this is because Stefan has reached a point in his sophistry where he is now openly claiming that the state, that is the commons, or you could say the public property, that is what is state controlled, is somehow now owned by taxpayers at large. And this has some very concerning implications from Stefan's standpoint. Now, I do want to also mention that there are many things that take place in this video, but I'm going to focus mostly on Stefan's contention about taxpayers owning the state property, you could say the state-controlled property, and a little bit on his collectivism in the video, just because there is so much hypocrisy in what he says, it really is hard to digest in just one sitting. So I'm just going to try to narrow in on some of the more finer points of that. So first, Stefan says in this video, and I'm quoting him here at 25-minute mark, "I do recognize the need for borders, and I do recognize the need for controls over immigration." He then later on goes on to say at 26:20, "We have a current system, as everybody knows, where the country is funded by taxpayers. Taxpayers own the country because the government is paid for by the taxpayers, not voluntarily. I accept all of that, but it is the taxpayers who pay for the roads, the education, the healthcare, the infrastructure, the border enforcement. That is all, in a sense, private property. The whole country is owned by the taxpayers." Now, Stefan's method of attempting to rationalize borders and immigration controls, which, mind you, he doesn't go into detail about the specifics of what those actions entail, I think, because he's trying to sophistically hide what he really believes so he can't get called out on declaring a need for state action, state violence, or crossing those borders. But he's saying these things because he's trying to bolster the point here that taxpayers somehow own collectively the public infrastructure, the roads, the commons, the state-controlled property that might be undeveloped to some extent. And there's a serious problem with this ideology. And that problem arises in the fact that Stefan is not only justifying forcible, coercive, collective ownership, which has an intrinsic competition over scarce resources. Again, with taxpayers, you're going to have people of different ideas about what should be done, and there is no pure hierarchy of decision rights without leaning on some type of collectivism, whether it is democracy, a majority rule, or some type of proxy democracy with representatives. No matter what way you cut it, in order to implement this ideology, you have to rely on collectivism because there is no ethical, precise order of hierarchy with property rights. Again, you have people who may want certain things to happen. You have others who may not want that to happen. Who gets to decide what this is? And Stefan covers up this contention by glossing over the fact that he has never conducted any kind of study whatsoever to discern who is considered a taxpayer and who is not. And he's never conducted any kind of study to discern what those people would actually want. And in that vein, it is practically impossible, or you could say impracticable, to actually do this. And the reason why is because the United States was founded on force and theft. It was founded on a small group of men claiming to own the bodies and properties of people at large by unilateral decree. It was limited. Only those of a certain age, usually 21 plus, and who owned land could participate in the early foundations. Later on, eventually, of course, there was some participation after slavery, after suffrage. But again, the entire structure from the inception was about unilateral decree, force, and theft as to people who are already existing and to their pre-established properties, people who had already homesteaded, people had already had families. And this is a serious problem because Stefan cannot meaningfully discern who is a real taxpayer in terms of what they gave versus what they got back and who is not. There's no way to sit there and actually itemize everybody's sales receipt to see sales tax, to itemize the welfare someone may have received, whether it was public schools or whether it was road use at a higher degree, or whether it was special cronyism through licensing or intellectual property. There is no way to account for all the possible inputs and outputs meaningfully for all people at all time. And if being honest, there is actually a noted income tax disparity between those who are the highest earners and those who are the lowest, because on the federal income tax alone, the top 1% pays about half. And if you go a couple more percentage points, we get to more than half of the taxes that are paid. Again, it's a very small group of people who are paying most of it. You could say the same thing about corporations, which again are a government fiction. Corporations are responsible for paying a number of taxes. And if you want to argue the pass down version of that, you could also argue that corporations maybe don't pay taxes per se, but are passing that down through in prices. And again, how are you allotting who is paying what in taxes and pass down based on consumer purchasing choices? This is truly an insane task to try to meter out. It is practically impossible to accurately do it, which means that any kind of analysis as to who is a real taxpayer is kind of a heuristic, because anybody could be a taxpayer the moment they buy something and pay sales tax, fill up their car at the gas station, pay gas tax, or pretty much do anything that involves travel or transport in the US, from tolls to getting a driver's license to getting a registration. There are just so many layers of taxation and intertwining that it's very hard to pull apart who has done what and who hasn't. And of course, that's further complicated. If you look at people who work for the state, are they considered taxpayers if they're getting pure redistributionism? Are people who are in the military who only work in it for a certain amount of time, are they considered net taxpayers because they did military service, you could say, for 6 years and then used a GI Bill after, but then eventually did private business? How about businesses that cater to the government contractors, people who have a certain portion of their business that goes to government sales, like a pizza place that has half of its business going to public schools where kids are buying pizzas for lunch? Again, there are so many facets to this that it takes a very myopic view to think you actually know who the discrete class of taxpayers are, with all forms of cronyism, historical and present, considered. Further, if we take a look here at the nature of the will of taxpayers, this mythical, monolithic concept that Stefan presents, it is absolutely an unmeasured ideology, because he has not actually, of course, figured out who these people would be. And further, he has not surveyed even a theoretical group of who these people would be. He hasn't asked them what they would want done as to certain policies regarding immigration or trade and travel. He's never done any of these things. And so every single thing he is saying is his heuristic of imposing his vision of what people really want. And it's much closer to socialism or communism than anything else, because we're talking about an ideology of shared collective ownership by force, where people are supposedly having this unified will of what they really want. This is extreme sophistry, and this is extreme deception, and it should be rejected outright, as it lacks both a longitudinal accuracy as to actors and actions, and it collectivizes, through a form of democracy, a type of tragedy of the commons, where people are supposedly equal owners, yet they have absolutely no material say in what happens with those elements of public property or infrastructure. And of course, what would Stefan say if these supposed net taxpayers or taxpayers, if they were surveyed and said, yes, we want more people to be able to immigrate, we want freer trade, we want people to be able to travel without restriction? Where would Stefan stand then? He'd have no ground to stand on, because those people actually want it, which is, of course, the problem of collectivism. When you have democracy and mob rule, you get a small group of people making the decisions for a larger group of people, regardless of their consent. And this is why his construct, again, must be rejected outright, because it violates property right norms. It violates the nature of non-aggression, and it violates the nature of being free to choose who can come to your property or who cannot, based on your own individual property rights. And one other thing that I just wanted to really emphasize about Stefan's interview with Tom Woods is his masking of his collectivism by suggesting that he is an individualist, that he's an anarcho-capitalist, while simultaneously using and engaging in collectivist terminology. He uses generalized terms like the left. He talks about race and IQ as generalities. He tries to downplay it, saying this doesn't speak to any particular individual, but then he tries to falsely extrapolate from this to suggest that for these reasons, people as entire groups should be judged and restricted based on government arbitrary lines called borders. And so Stefan here is engaging in doublespeak and in groupthink while gaslighting the audience that he isn't, which is extremely sophistic of him to do and extremely disappointing of him, considering his long history of focusing on individual actors and individual harms. And Stefan has wholesale ignored historical causation and effects, legal structures and abuses, and the nature of statism and influences that have led to disruptions across the globe and have fostered the things that he is supposedly afraid of. And so it is very disappointing to see Stefan use generalizations like the left or we or our in collectivist terms and synecdoche and other types of anthropomorphism to hide the fact that he really isn't an individualist. He is now a collectivist, a nationalist. Even when he's trying to say he's really not, everything he is arguing for clearly demonstrates that he is. Thanks everybody for taking a listen, and if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to post in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can, as I really do enjoy discussing these things and calling out when someone is being sophistic, especially by masking their collectivism and gaslighting people about it. Take care everybody.